So this is going to be a little bit different, and who knows, this one actually might reach the key ships and key aircraft aim of being 25 minutes long. Sorry. Look, I had to try. I have to try. It's my aim. But when I did some key ship videos about some 64s, their links will appear up above. One of the questions that came through was, well, why did they have the 64s? Why did they have the 74s? What are the differences? What are the points for them all? And where do they sort of come from? And where do all these ships come from? And that was a really interesting question. But it started me down the route of going, right then, so for my next key ship series, I was planning doing aircraft carriers. And I thought, well, why don't I alternate between aircraft carriers and a key ship's approach to a rating? I thought, that's a good one. It'll be fun, it'll be interesting, it'll be something different. And it'll be some interesting bit of history. An interesting bit of comparison, because today we have a very fixed approach in that we have the aircraft carrier, we know what capabilities, know what operational mission sort of sets we must be looking for if we're going to require an aircraft carrier, and then we build a force around it. Whereas the rated fleets, they're really the last fleets which were organic creations. And I'm not just talking about the fact they used wood to build them and they were always looking for good wood. No. What I'm talking about is the fact that they were building the fleets as it fitted. And you can see this from one thing. One key thing. Whilst the ships which are at the bottom level, the pinnaces, the cutters, the sloops, the brigs, they sort of stay roughly there. And stay roughly around the size. The reason the scale comes in and the rating scale comes in isn't because of a dropping down. They don't start off with the big and work their way. No. It's because the big keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the rates pop in to fill that gap and have to be adjusted to fill that gap. Because the first rates when they begin, they're 60-gun ships. Yes. There's the dirty little secret for you. The origins of the 64, that's the original first rate. And when I say the original first rate, that is a bit of an interesting discussion to get into, because, and this is why I'm doing the key ships approach to it, first rates start out as just being the larger ships. And they were going to roughly have 3 decks of guns, became in quite common. At one point it was 80 guns, then it was 100, then it was more than 100. And it starts out, though, often we talk about James I of England, mainly because when he became, first and second, when he became King of England, he inherited quite a fleet in some regards, but it was in the various states of repair. And it was mostly divided up into great, middling, and lesser craft. And there were also ships royale, which were the largest and most prestigious ships. And they could each carry 400 men, and they would have roughly 60 guns, but they were converted galleons. In fact, 3 of them had fought against the Spanish Armada in 1588. 3 of them, of the ships they had. Their first ones were Elizabeth Jonas, Triumph, White Bear, Marinana, Ark Royal, and Victory. And I'll be getting into a bit of discussion of them in a bit. The thing is, as naval architecture improves, as our understanding of ships improves, and as our understanding of what we can construct improves, and as the quality cannon improve, ships get bigger and bigger and bigger. So very quickly, from about 1600, late 1500s to the early 1600s, when they had 60 guns, 64 guns, by 1665-ish, they were being 90 to 100 guns. And they could get bigger. There was also a thing in that sometimes you would get the gun numbers increase, but then other times you get the gun sizes increase. So sometimes the numbers wouldn't go up, but the weight of firepower would go up dramatically, because naval architecture supported having more powerful guns, and the metallurgy had developed more powerful guns. So there are periods when you see the number of guns go up, And there's periods when it's the guns which change, and the only thing that's consistent the whole way through going up is the broadside weight increases. And its fastest increase is usually when it's actually the guns which are changing rather than the size of the ship. But the size of the ship can have other bearings. You see, first rates, when they first start, are very useful ships for a battle if you're fighting that close to where you're operating from. They're incredibly useful ships. But unless you're basically bombing around the English Channel, fighting between the British and the French, or you are wandering up and down the Spanish coast to France, etc., they're really not that useful, because when they are first being built, they do not have the space, they do not have the capacity for the supplies necessary for long voyages. And actually, this leads to some very interesting work when we look at the earlier naval history, because you almost end up with... how do I put this? So, you almost end up with dedicated supply ships running out to the first rates when they're with fleets. Every other ship can carry supplies, but the first rates almost seem to have their own dedicated supplier ship to make sure they have food and other things they need, because they just can't. You know, this example here is the Royal George. She was low enough in the water with the weight of the artillery that when she opened her lower gun ports, she sunk. And that's the other problem with first rates. They are so heavy that if you do not design them properly, you can have real problems. Now, the thing is, how they started at the beginning, in the 1600s, and what they evolved to, by the time you're talking about HMS Victory, by the time you're dealing with the ships after HMS Victory, and after the Battle of Trafalgar, are two different things. There's an evolution going on. And that evolution is where a lot of the rating system comes in. Where a lot of the rating system comes from. Because it's as the ships develop. And arguably, again, with the 74s and the 64s, you're talking about the 1600s, earlier 1600s, to about the 1620s, 1630s, generation of first rates in size and performance. Once they start getting onto 3 decks, once they start getting really big, that's when you have the truly strange stuff happening with them. Now, I always do a shameless book plug in all my videos. There's a reason I do a shameless book plug. I'm an academic. It says so on the tin. And in the UK, for an academic to get promoted, to get a permanent post, to do all those things, they need to sell books. And the only one who's going to advertise my books is me. So whilst I really do like it when people like, share and subscribe to the channel, when they support the channel out to grow, and we're over 12,000 subscribers now, which is scary. Because let's be honest, that's more students than most academic departments I've worked in. In fact, it's pretty much more students than all academic departments I've worked in, unless you really expand the definition of some of those departments. And that, to me, is wonderful, because I do this channel to share my love of naval history and do my best to make it as communicable a disease as possible. But that's all thanks to you. And the book sales are thanks to you, so thank you. And if you want to keep supporting the channel, please like and share and subscribe is a great thing. And if you feel like supporting the book habit, which underpins the channel, and the iron brew habit, which allows me the energy and caffeine to keep going, even when life is really being weird in terms of having to move house, hence the boxes all behind me, then please consider Patreon, Ko-fi, and membership of the channel. Those are all great things and all really help. And patrons get to choose topics, suggest and choose topics. What they do is they suggest topics, and then I put those topics into a vote, and then everyone gets to vote. So if you don't want to suggest a topic, but you want to vote, you can just vote. If you want to suggest topics, but you don't feel like voting, you don't have to. But if you want to do both, and the amount of people who suggest a topic, and then afterwards I go, it's a shame your topic didn't win, it came close, and they go, oh, I didn't vote for it. Why? You didn't vote for your own topic. No, I really like the other question. You can vote for as many as you like. It's set up so you can literally vote for all the ones you like. And they still sometimes don't vote for their own. Oh. And the fact is, I know more than one person who's done that now in Patreon. And I love all my patrons. They're so kind and generous to support us. And support me with this all. And, you know, I know they support other historians as well online. And it's so kind of them. But then they don't even vote for their own suggestions sometimes. Did laugh. The one who actually suggested topic their suggestion won, but they hadn't voted for it. They voted for any other ones. Oh, I'm just going. I don't know whether to commiserate you or congratulate you with this information. It's confusing me. I'm a my little historian brain is overloading at this point. So HMS Victory is probably the most famous first rate of all time, and with good reason. For starters, as a first rate, she's not built as a class. There are some first rates which are sort of classes, but whilst all ships of the line, realistically, because of the time it takes to build them, are sort of to an extent individual. They are third rates. Even second rates, to an extent, are usually grouped into classes. For the lower you go, the more common it is for it to be a class structure, and less likely for it to be a one-off. I.e., we've produced this design, this template, we're going to send it out to multiple shipyards, build it. And there'll be slight variations on them, but it's not quite the same as French yards and the French Navy in the late 1890s and early 1900s, but it is more of an individual approach. So much carpentry, so many skills, so many masters involved who know how to get the best out of wood out of the wood they have in their own way, and will do so. So you get some variations. First rates, they are truly special ships. When William Pitt the Elder orders 12 ships in December 1758, it includes one first rate, HMS Victory, and that goes straight to Thomas Slade. Now, Sir Thomas Slade was the Surveyor of the Navy, one of the Joint Chief Surveyors of the Navy, and that's a post which, in more modern times, becomes the Directors of Naval Construction. There is a discussion as whether it's the Controller of the Navy, but no, this is a naval architect. This is a senior naval and this is a senior engineer, and they're often civilians or they've come up through the dockyard system. They are not naval officers. I know some people do like to link the postal surveyor to the control of the Navy, but realistically what happens is the functions are the administration of it and duties are turned over to control Navy, but the actual function is turned over to the Chief Naval Constructor, the Director of Naval Construction, because that's where the skills go, and that's where the people move to, and that's where the roles transition into. Now, he was ordered, someone said, to base his new ship on the Royal George, a previous first-rate ship. Well, there's an interesting story of Royal George. She starts off being laid down in 1746 as part of the 1745 establishment as the Royal Anne. Now, at that point, Jacob Ackworth is the sole surveyor of the Royal Navy. But then he's joined by Joseph Allen later on, and then Ackworth dies in roughly 1749, and Joseph Allen continues on. And Slade and Bately are appointed jointly to replace him in 1755. And in that time, well, the Royal George is laid down, as said, in 1746. Its construction, well, the war ends in 1748, so its construction slows to a snail's pace. It's renamed the Royal George, and in 1756 it's completed. So, in that point, it has been through having Allen leading its design and construction, to it being taken over after he dies by, well, no, Ackworth leading its design and construction, then Allen taking over after Ackworth dies, and then Slade and Bately coming in and finishing it off. The fact that the Royal George turns out as well as it does is a feat of skill on behalf of the builders, because that's some very senior changes and very different viewpoints. If you look at the construction of Ackworth and his view on how to construct ships, and then you consider Slade's, and you consider that Allen's and Bately's, those are four very different personalities. Those are four very different approaches to construction. They have some overlap, but they have differences. And being ordered to base his first rate on this one, I think he more took it as a oeuvre, as an idea, than as a reality. And Victory herself is not exactly a quick build. She is laid down in 1759, and she is launched in 1765. But she is not first commissioned till 1778. Why? Because first rates are expensive to operate, because you only need them in times of war, and she actually, like the Royal George, finds herself in a period of peace. She finds herself going, well, do we need an extra first rate wandering around against the ones we already have? Not really. Let's be honest, the Royal George herself finds herself in a 3-year-long refit very shortly. You see, the thing is, a first rate is a valuable asset. You don't want to wear it out when you don't need to. And also, and this is even more important, you don't want to crew it when you don't need to. In peacetime, you need presence ships. In wartime, you need warships. Now, yes, there are several ships which can be used for the presence mission, which are very good warships. But in wartime, you need a first rate. Peacetime? Honestly, a third rate can wander around and go, do you really want to try this? And quite often, what's actually turning up is a fifth rate, or even a sixth rate, or something smaller, to go, hello, we're your friendly and local presence vessel. We do counter-piracy, counter-smuggling, all these sorts of trade protection and commerce protection and maritime security missions. And if you really want to muck things up, you attack us, because then something bigger will turn up. And if you attack that, then the really big thing will turn up, at the head of a lot of other big things, to start explaining the facts of life and the application of high explosive. Because honestly, you don't activate a first rate unless you're going for a fight. It's too expensive, and it's too, how do I put this, costly in resources to do so otherwise. But there's also the thing that if you are going for a fight, you take a first rate with you, because nothing kicks quite as hard as a mule that size. Well, Age of Sail is a rather appropriate thing to discuss this one. Hello, we have got Scandi Ship 2024 going. Now, for those who don't know, myself, Drakinafel, Garius the Brit, aka John Bull, aka so many different internet personas, it worries me. I'm sometimes think he might be having a conversation with himself, and Dr. Dan, and hopefully to be joined by a fifth gentleman, Chemist Dan, are going on another trip. Now, we've had a lot of lessons learned, and there's a link down below to the website where we're fundraising for it. As of Australia last year, it's entirely dependent on your support. And anyone who does support us is really greatly appreciated, because we need to raise the money. Doing naval history, doing all this is not cheap. In this one, we are going around we're going around Norway. We're doing Oslo. We've added in Oslo. Found a way to add Oslo in for a bit. So we're going to do at least a meet and greet with people in Oslo, if not, and hopefully some museums. Narvik, where we'll be doing around museums and another meet and greet, a dinner sort of with people. That's what we normally do. Karlskrona, Karlskoga, Stockholm, and Helsinki. And we're planning to do that basically over a 23-day period, pretty much. 24, perhaps, if you add in all the flight days, because we leave on the I definitely leave on the 14th of June if we manage to raise the money, and we get back on the 8th of July. So a little over 3 weeks. Now, the thing is, what we always do with the funding, and we ask for when we're asking funding, what is the funding for? The funding is for the flights, the hotels, and not any of the transport costs. That's it. That's what we're asking for funding for. We do our own food. We do all that as we normally do. It's just these are the expenses which we wouldn't normally have in that month, and we want to bring a lot more history to you. Now, I'm planning on putting the videos which I shot in Australia up at some point this year. They're probably gonna. I was hoping to make them part of the summer travel and cover for while we're away in June, July if we go away this, but with all the house moving, I haven't managed to edit them to my satisfaction. They're not organised to my satisfaction. They're just not. And whilst I will admit that I can't always get the sound correct, and I cannot get everything else always perfect, because I'm trying with systems, but they don't always work to the way they're supposed to, I do like to get the content in terms of the history and the structure I'm trying to deliver correct, and I want it to be done correctly. So they're probably going to be part of the Christmas series, but they'll be added in now with the Scandinavia Christmas series. I'll have the Australia trip videos and I'll have the Scandinavia trip videos, and they'll all come out Christmas this year as part of the Christmas series. And a lot of that's thanks to you. Now, I'm going to say this. So far, the transition to the next slide, I have flubbed up about a dozen times. And I keep ending up pulling funny faces and sticking my tongue out at weird points. I'm going to apologise now. I'm going to try. This is take 15 of this transition. And if it goes right, woohoo! Please celebrate with me. I will literally be doing a small hand clap to myself. I do not know why the transition to this slide, what defines a first rate, keeps going wrong. So, it starts off as, already mentioned, ships royal, capable of carrying at least 400 men, and every navy, every nation has their own equivalents to these ships. So please, do not take some of the approaches which is, this is an English invention. It's not. There are lots of nations who have large ships at this point. One of the things that is an English invention is that because of the nature of Britain's port facilities, of its island status, of the fact it has rather large supplies of wood, and thanks to Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, all prior to King James, and ongoing through King James, Charles I, Charles II, and etc., and the interregnum, when we have pretty much it's Oliver Cromwell, we have a very mature industry for managing the wood, for managing the supplies of trees. So we have the incentive, we have the ability, we have the need. So we do develop these quite quickly and quite coherently. But we're of course not the only ones, and we're not the ones necessarily always setting the pace. In fact, one of the things that does come out in the history, and people sometimes point to, is they go, well, the Spanish were building even bigger ships. Yes, the Spanish do build bigger ships, and we're talking about those in a second. But the fact is, the British usually have more of them, because they need more of them. And that's the other realization you have in this period, and one of the reasons why the rating system gets a bit weird for people to sort of work out, why is an 80 gun here, not here, sort of thing. Especially when, in an earlier period again, 80 guns were first rates. 100 guns were first raters, 120 guns are first raters. The point is, for a nation which needs them, they're going to build them, but there's also going to be a difference of how many you're going to build. How many first rates do you want? What are you doing with them? For the Royal Navy, these are usually the major fleet capital ships. They are the flagships. They are the bulwarks of the fighting line. They are in many ways what Winston Churchill imagines Nelson and Rodney to be. Winston Churchill has this great line about Nelson and Rodney when they're being built, because he's pushed in many ways for a battleship design, not a fast battleship design, a battleship design. He's been part of that. He wants them as these unsinkable bulwarks of the battle line. Everyone's telling him the battle line's not going to happen again, that Jutland is not going to be recreated in any future war, that era has moved and that type of warfare has changed, because there's going to be no scenario now where someone can afford to have their entire massed fleet together to fight a massed fleet because of the nature of war, but also because the fact that the only scenario where that could happen, for Britain at least, you'd have to be fighting America, in which case you wouldn't concentrate your fleet, because the best advantage of the British versus the Americans would have been to split their fleet up, and because the American ships were usually slower, it's an advantage. The American battle line is pretty much all slower than the British battle line, so you can use that 1 or 2 knot advantage to do some very interesting things with them, and the battle cruisers especially. Or if you're against the Japanese, yeah, you're going to be a concentrating force, but you also need speed. You need to maneuver in things like the South China Sea, etc., in which case speed's an advantage. But nope. He wanted them, and he was pushing for them as unsinkable bulwarks of the battle line. Well, honestly, first-rate ships are closer to that figure. Let's be honest. A wooden ship, by its very nature, wants to float. Wood likes to float. And so there's a lot of floatability within a wooden first-rate. But it's also a very large amount of firepower. Now, it's not an unsinkable bulwark. There is no such thing as an unsinkable bulwark. I mean, it's only ever politicians and advertisers who make such claims about equipment or systems. But leaving them to one side, the first rates were this bulwark of the battle line. And as such, they were a very good position for a senior admiral. They're also usually taller. They're 3 decks. That was the other advantage of second rates. They were usually a 3-deck ship. And that's really the problem for the second rate, and we'll be talking about this when we do them, in that your 2 options for your third rates, fourth rates, they're your 2-deck ships. Your 5th rates and below are your single gun deck ships. Your second rates and first rates are your 3-deck ships, and that gives you height. Let's be honest, once you're going through the effort of building something which is going to be 3 decks high, and doing all this stuff which comes out with that, you're probably better off going with a first rate for length to beam ratios and for stability reasons. Probably. But what does define a first rate? All this discussion, what defines a first rate? It's the biggest ship you can build. But that's not really the case, is it? Because some of the nations can't build ships as big as others, so they're not a first rate. Because it's the biggest they can build. So, realistically, a first rate is the biggest ship that can be built with the technology available at the time. And that's what a first rate is for its own period. They are the glorious capital ships. They are the great statements of capital intent. They are the equivalent of a nation going, look how powerful we are. They are a very visible deterrent in many regards. Think about this. As said, when HMS Victory is ordered in 1758, William Pitt the Elder placed an order for 12 ships to be constructed, including a first rate. And to illustrate that point, you really need to consider how many were actually built in the 1700s, in the 18th century. Now, here is something interesting, because I have read some beautiful stats written about HMS Victory, including that, she was one of 10 first rates the Royal Navy built in this period. Well, this is the small problem. In the 1700s, there are roughly 15 first rates which serve in the Royal Navy in the whole over the century. And one of those was built by the Spanish, so I think it's down to 14. These 5, the Royal Anne down to the Royal William, were all originally constructed in the 1670s and went through major massive rebuilds. Okay, so they're not really a good option. So that's taken us down to 9, including Victory. And I suppose that's sort of your 10, but that's still not 10. It's 9. And maybe they round up. Maybe they got confused. Maybe there's all sorts of potential reasons. But life happens. It's 9. And that's a big thing. If we think in 1794, the Royal Navy had 6 first rates on the books. HMS Britannia, HMS Victory, HMS San Josef, which have been captured at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent by the lovely irreplaceable Nelson. HMS Royal Sovereign. That name likes to turn up quite a lot in Royal Navy history. HMS Royal George and HMS Queen Charlotte. Now, one of the interesting things to point out here is that Queen Charlotte is launched in 1790. She's lost to a fire in 1800. So in less than 10 years, she's burnt. And why I'm using 1794 as an example? Well, because if you consider all the slides I've ever done on the rating system prior, I usually put up, the rating system as it was as a history, what Pitt defined it, and talk it through. And at some point in one of these videos, I probably will do, probably in the second rates, I'll use it again. And you'll know that in that year, the Royal Navy has 5 of their first rates in commission in 1794. That's 5 of 6 that they have on their books. That's pretty darn good. In 1814, they have 11 on the books, including most of those 6 from 1794, barring Queen Charlotte, which had burned in 1800, and so they launched the new Queen Charlotte in 1810. She's renamed HMS Excellent in 1860 and broken up in 1892. She has her own history. And this video is another good reason for me to have blood pressure issues, because when you realise how close we were to having so many of these gorgeous ships still around. I mean, HMS Nelson, yes, she's launched in 1814, but she's broken up in 1928. That's so close. So Hibernia, launched in 1804, led the escort of the Portuguese royal family to Brazil, broken up in 1902. So close, yet so far. We had 11 on the books in 1814 for the Royal Navy, and they had 8 operational. Now, admittedly, one of those on the books is HMS Victory herself, which was by that point already on her way to becoming a shrine to Nelson and Trafalgar. So yeah, fun times, definitely. The point is, these ships are rare. These ships are special. These ships are major investments, and losing them is a massive thing. And having the British highlighting, they've got both San Josef and Ville de Paris on their strength, highlighting, we took your first rates off you. That is a massive statement of power and naval prowess. And this leads us to the Royal Navy's first rate. Now, please note, the 92-gun HMS Prince Royal was launched in 1610, yes. But realistically, she doesn't become a first rate in 1610 because in 1610 she's launched as a 55-gun Royal ship. In 1641 she's rebuilt as a 70-gun ship. And in 1663 she becomes a 92-gun ship. So she's often classed as the first ship to be a first rate as we would usually understand it in the mold of HMS Victory. But just let's consider that. She is in service for, well, she's launched in 1610, so is on the books for 53 years officially before she becomes a first rate. Now, you could say, wow, that's amazing, she serves so well, she must have been such a useful ship. Or you could, like me, and think, well, she starts off as 1,200 tons burthen and is a 55-gun ship in 1610. In 1641, she goes to 1,187 tons, so still roughly the same, and a 70-gun ship, without theoretically changing much of her dimensions at all. But there were 70 guns of various weights of shot, is what we describe. And then they were increased to 88 in 1653, then back to 80 in 1660, and then in 1663 she goes for another rebuild. And she then becomes 1,432 tons burthen. She goes from 115-foot long keel, that's 35 meters, to 132-foot, 40-meter keel. She goes from being a beam of 43 foot 6 inches, or 13.26 meters, to 45 foot 2 inches, that's 13.77 meters. And the depth in the hold also gains an extra 10 inches. Yes, this is the same ship. Unfortunately, she's then captured by the Dutch in that really annoying raid they carried out in 1666. What can I say? The Dutch had good taste. But again, this reinforces the point. These ships started out with 55 guns, 60 guns, as 64 guns was a heavy, potent first rate, in equivalence. And they evolve. Now, the benefits and problems of first rates, I've already alluded this to an extent. I've alluded to this in that sometimes they can be really useful. When you need them to crack something, they are what you need to crack it. But they're also expensive, they require a lot of crew, they have the manoeuvring habits of an oil tanker. How do I put this? It's actually worse than an oil tanker. They might be smaller than an oil tanker, but when they describe them as nimble or fast, it's for a first rate. Now, the thing is, some of them were quite fast, even by their time, but it's like the Bentley versus the Ferrari scenario. I'm not sure who it was who described the Bentley as this, the world's fastest lorry. Because they basically went, we've got a nice solid frame, let's add the biggest engine we possibly can to it. In the case of the Royal Navy's first rates like Victory and others that were very fast for their equivalency, they were copper bottomed. They had a hull shape which allowed them to get as much speed out of while still providing the British characteristics and requirements for stability and supplies as possible. And they could pack on every ounce of sail that it was physically possible to put on a ship. And then in the right sort of weather, they could outpace frigates. much to the frigate's displeasure. Complete displeasure. But realistically, that's not what you have them for. As said, they're the flagship for your admiral. They provide them with an unparalleled ability to see the world around them, thanks to their size. They supply them with something which is a literal fortress at sea. You are wondering how powerful this fleet that's been sent to you is, and you see these rows upon rows of ships coming in, and suddenly the biggest and most powerful of all these powerful ships, which are already sort of going, oh my lord, that's my entire army's supply of artillery on one ship, and they have a dozen of them. And then this thing comes in, a first rate, which has even more guns, which is not a 2-decker, but a 3-decker. And upon it you see a well-drilled crew running around, smartly dressed, and officers in gold braid, staring imperiously down at you on the shore. You get an impression of the nation you're dealing with. It's a powerful statement. The interesting thing whenever I discuss it with students is they come from it from either two possibilities. One, they're surprised at once they realize how much, and I've done videos in the past about constructing Age of Sail ships, so please go back, look at them, they're from a year of technology. They are surprised at how many of these there are built because of how much it takes to construct them. And at the same time, others are surprised that so many are built because they are such a commitment of resources. They are such a focus of resources. They're powerful. They're capable. They are the centerpieces of your fleet. And in the case of some, they are truly magnificent in scale and in size. This is the Santissima Trinidad, which, for those who don't realize, starts life as a mere 112 gun first rate. However, when her architect, Matthew Mullen, dies in 1767, his son, Ignacio Mullen, and yes, we are talking about an Irish naval architect who had Spanished up his name to Mateo Mullen to where he'd emigrated to, and then his son Ignacio takes over. The ship is launched in 1769, completed as a 116 gun 3-decker, not 112 guns. And she is larger, therefore, than Victory or Bretagne, and she's captured at Trafalgar. Scuttled the next day, but captured at Trafalgar. And honestly, if the wars had continued on longer, I'm fairly sure the Royal Navy would have built a ship and called it the Santissima Trinidad. Because that's what the Royal Navy do, hence the Ville de Paris. And if you want real fun, think about how they're going to explain that one to the British public and British political classes who hate anything which sounds like even a hint of Catholicism and Popery after the joy of James II. Now, of course, she didn't stay there. She didn't stay at roughly 116 guns. No. She kept growing larger because when the French produced 120 gun ships, they decided to join her forecastle to her quarterdeck and create a fourth deck, which would give her 130 guns. Well, it was hoped for 136 guns, but they reduced it to 130. And at points they were trying for 140. Technically, she is certainly capable in terms of piercings and spacings of carrying 140 guns. But she seems in practice to have kept to roughly 130-ish. And I'm going to emphasize the ish there. Now, why is this? Why is this a Spanish ship, not a French or a British ship? Why even the French pushing for 120 gunships and the British are not? Why? Well, it's that old paradox. You can either be strong in overall strength or individual strength. You can try for both, but it's very expensive. If you want to have the strongest fleet in terms of numbers and quantity, and also individually the strongest vessels, it's extortionate. Now that usually means you seek a balance, because you can't really afford to have a massive fleet of terrible ships. They tend to get wiped out quite quickly. But you also can't afford to have a fleet of just the top rate ships, because you probably can't afford enough to be in the places you need to be. Now, the less you're able to afford numbers, for whatever reason, infrastructure sustainment, the ability to get the personnel, commitments to the army, the realistic resource availability of the necessary materials to build and sustain such a fleet, all those things, the more you're tempted to go for strength of the individual unit. Because if you make the individual unit as strong as it possibly can, it counts as a deterrent, because it means your opponent has to bring 2 ships or 3 ships to guarantee to be able to fight such a behemoth. And the French, who are often facing the same problem as the Spanish, but less so. The French are able to build up their fleet. The Spanish are far more restricted in fleet numbers and are trying to build them up, but they don't have the same resources and the same support and the same level of bureaucracy as even the French achieve, and that's saying something when you consider the amount of chops and changes that are going on in France at this period. They're pushing it more on, we want to have the most powerful ships in the world, so that everyone knows if they have to fight us, they have to bring a full fleet. They have to come heavy, or they don't come. This is also a good way of, if you're in an alliance, of being able to punch above your weight by perhaps your volume. For example, Britain. Good example of this. The Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. The skills and capabilities of Type 45 area defense destroyers and the Type 26s, as they're going to be coming into service. And even the Type 31s. All these vessels are very good on their own. Very capable vessels. But they really shine in 2 scenarios. One, if Britain is fighting a minor conflict solo against a near peer or lesser power, they can pull together enough firepower, they can deliver a good account for themselves. But the moment they'll really shine is if you put them into an allied task force dealing with a major issue. And they will provide the flagship and carrier organic air capability. They'll provide the lead air defense warfare capability, and they'll provide the lead anti-submarine warfare capability, which will allow them to coordinate allies and work with them consistently. And that's the reality. You have to, at a certain point, look at your resources and go, am I building enough to be a power on my own? On all occasions? Am I building enough to be a power on my own on some occasions, but other occasions do I want to be the centerpiece of an alliance? Or am I completely dependent upon an alliance? And you build to adjust. Well, you adjust your build accordingly. Now, what we have here is the last ship of the line. The Royal Navy builds. And when I say that, I mean ship of the line as in built as a ship of the line. HMS Victoria is launched in 1859. HMS Warrior comes into service in 1860. She's a beautiful illustration of what has been happening up to this point. The Royal Navy is continuing on. Yes, they've got to 120 odd guns, as they're pretty much standardish. fit for first-rate ships at this point. And they're very capable vessels. They're very useful vessels. And the Royal Navy's still concentrating on having volume, because volume is what allows them to be present around the world. Doesn't matter whether it's first rates, first rates, some second rates or third rates, whatever they're building, they want a level of volume. Now, the first rates don't really do that much. They mostly hang around the UK when they are actually commissioned, rather than sitting there around in ordinary. Occasionally they go off around the world as far-flung places to go and visit, or to demonstrate just how much high explosive and firepower can be applied by the Royal Navy should the circumstances require it. But this is the cusp of the end of their period. This is the point at which they've reached the level of maturity where they're great, but things are about to change. They're capable, but things are about to go completely different on them. The first rates are the dominant presence in the world for over 200 years. For over 200 years, the ship you most don't want to hear your opponent has is a first rate. Because that means they are sending their biggest, baddest, meanest, most powerful thing they have against you. A second rate's not much of an improvement. It's just not a first rate. A first rate showing up, that means your opponent is not just serious, but they are prepared to spend serious coin to see you not survive, or to see this operation is carried out. They are sending something which is a focal point, which is not just a symbol of the nation in terms of its power, but also a symbol of the nation's trust in that admiral, in that senior officer. Yes, you have a first rate to command. Use it well. To give you an idea, it's like if a king says, "These are some of my royal guard, take them with you. They will protect you and be your personal champions." Or, we can go through history. There are examples of that sort of scenario. It's a very visible symbol, not just of the state and its power that's deploying this asset, but of the importance of this mission to that state and of their faith in the officer in charge of it. At every single level, the officer in charge of it. There is a reason why first rates normally do as well as they do in battles. It's because no one really wants to put an idiot at any level in their command chain. So, I normally finish videos with a question, and I'm not going to get out of that habit now. But I want you to think, do we still have an equivalent of a first rate? Now, I know the quick answer is going to come around. Aircraft carriers. But think about it. Is it? Is an aircraft carrier necessarily the equivalent of a first rate? If it is, what's the case for it being? And if it isn't, is there still something which has the case of being a first rate? Or do we no longer have that? Have we moved beyond that sort of idea and terminology, or that sort of framework? I'd be interested to hear what you say. And what do we have coming up next week? We have Carriers of the War Fleet on the 4th of June. Anyway, thank you very much. If you liked the video, please do consider liking, sharing and subscribing. That really helps the channel grow. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you had as much fun as I did recording it. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel by either Patreon, Ko-fi or membership. That's very kind of you. And again, please go have a look at the Scandi ship trip. It's really any help is gratefully received, as it's going to be some great history. Thank you.